The Hungry Stones is a short story centering on a seemingly supernatural experience. Macmillan published it in New York City in 1916 as the title piece in a collection of Tagore's stories. The action takes place in the late 19th century on a passenger train in eastern India and at a train station as the main characters await another train bound for Calcutta, now called Kolkata. Plot summary. While returning to Calcutta from a religious pilgrimage, the narrator and his friend meet a strange man on the train. He can converse intelligently on any subject, even the most trivial, quoting from science and poetry. So deep is his knowledge that the narrator's friend, a theosophist, thinks the man receives inspiration from the supernatural, the occult, or an astral body. The narrator's friend begins taking notes, and the man seems pleased. After getting off at the junction at 10 p.m. to change trains, the travelers learn that the next train will be considerably late. The narrator prepares to take a nap, but the strange man begins to tell a story. The narrator, already under the spell of the man, decides to stay up and hear it. The story follows. The strange man will be referred to as the second narrator. He tells his story in first-person point of view. One day, after quitting his job at Junagadh over a disagreement on administrative policy, the second narrator begins work as a collector of cotton duties at Burreach, a pleasant locale. There, the Sasta River chatters over stony ways and babbles on the pebbles flowing in from the woods below hills. 150 steps up from the river is a marble palace. There are no houses near it. The cotton market is some distance away. About 250 years before, the Emperor Muhammad Shah II built the palace for his pleasure and luxury, the second narrator says. Its fountains spurted rose water, and in its rooms young Persian girls would sing and splash their feet in the waters of the reservoirs. Now, however, only tax collectors stay there. Karim Khan, an old clerk in the second narrator's office, warns him never to stay at the palace. Pass the day there if you like, the clerk says, but never stay the night. Even thieves keep away from the place. Despite the warning, the second narrator decides to lodge there. When he returns from work at the end of the day, he finds the solitude of the place almost unbearable. After a week, he begins to feel as if the palace is alive and is slowly and imperceptibly digesting me. He first notices this feeling one summer evening towards sunset when he is seated on the steps gazing at the scene before him. The Sasta River is low, and he can see the pebbles at the bottom glistening. As the sun drops behind the hills and the landscape darkens, he hears a sound on the steps behind him. When he rises and looks around, no one is there. As he sits down again, he hears a rush of footsteps and thinks he sees maidens coming down the steps. Although he knows that no one is there but him, he clearly hears the maidens running by him on their way to the river. As they were invisible to me, so I was, as it were, invisible to them. It is as if they are on the other side of a curtain. Then a strong wind ripples the waters and sweeps away the ghostly presence of the maidens. In the morning, he looks upon the experience as a queer fantasy, he says, and goes to work. However, when he returns, he has a feeling that the maidens are there again. As he enters, he senses a rush of beings leaving the palace through windows and doors and corridors. But he sees no one, although a faint scent of perfume seems to be in the air. Standing in a hall between rows of pillars, he then hears the splash of fountain water, the notes of a guitar, the jingling and tinkling of ornaments and chandelier pendants, the ringing of bells sounding the hours, and the singing of birds. Suddenly, this strange world becomes reality and his workday world at the cotton market an illusion. Or so it seems. After supper, he goes to bed in a small room. Through a window, he can see a star peering down and falls asleep. He awakens later as moonlight is stealing into the room. Although he sees no one, he feels a woman pushing him. She waves a hand for him to follow her, and he does her bidding, envisioning her in his mind as a girl with a veil on her face. She stops before a blue screen and points to a Negro eunuch on the other side. He sits dozing with a sword on his lap. The girl lifts the screen, and the second narrator sees part of a room with a Persian carpet. From a bed, the feet of a woman in pajamas reach to the carpet. A tray of fruit, 2 cups, and a decanter await the arrival of a guest. When the second narrator enters this scene and attempts to step over the eunuch's outstretched legs, the eunuch awakens and the sword falls to the floor. Then the second narrator awakens to the early morning sun. Time passes. During the day, the second narrator goes to work, always tired from his strange experiences of the night before. But in the evening when he returns, he looks forward to these experiences. Repeatedly, he becomes a person from an earlier age who takes part in unwritten history. He might be wearing an English coat, breeches, and red velvet cap in anticipation of a meeting with the beloved one. He might also wander about the palace to see what will happen to him next. Sometimes, while dressing himself as a royal prince, he would catch a glimpse of a Persian beauty in the mirror. But in a moment she would disappear. At such times, he would go to bed and fall asleep as a serpent entwined him. One evening, he decides to go for a ride on his horse. But as he is about to put on his English coat and hat, a powerful wind enters and whirls them around. He hears laughter and abandons the idea of taking a ride. The next day, he decides never again to wear the coat and hat. In the evening, he hears a woman crying out for him to rescue her by breaking through these doors of hard illusion and carry her away on a horse. He wonders who she is, where she came from. He envisions a Bedouin kidnapping her from her mother and taking her to a slave market, where a man buys her for his master's harem. The master, a great king, worships at her feet while the eunuch with the sword stands nearby. When the second narrator awakens, he then decides that he cannot stay another night in the palace. So he packs his belongings and moves to his place of employment. In the evening, however, he ends up back at the palace and enters the dark silence. 2 teardrops fall from above on his brow. The doors of the palace bang, and the hallways moan. Next to the bed he has been sleeping on, he perceives the presence of a woman lying on the carpet and tearing at her hair. She is sobbing. A storm rages through the night. The narrator wanders through the palace, wondering who it is who is sobbing with such intense grief and sorrow. When he is at work, Karim Khan tells him. At one time countless unrequited passions and unsatisfied longings and lurid flames of wild blazing pleasure raged within that palace. And that the curse of all the heartaches and blasted hopes had made its every stone thirsty and hungry, eager to swallow up like a famished ogress any living man who might chance to approach. Not one of those who lived there for 3 consecutive nights could escape these cruel jaws save Mohir Ali, who had escaped at the cost of his reason. He asks Karim whether there is anything he can do to break the spell of the palace on him. The old man says he knows a way. But first the second narrator must listen to the story of a young Persian girl who once lived in the palace. However, at the very moment that the second narrator is about to tell the first narrator and the theosophist what Karim said, the train to Calcutta arrives. While the travelers are picking up their bags, an Englishman looking out the window of a first-class car sees the second narrator approaching. He calls to him and invites him into his compartment. Because the 2 travelers must take a second-class car, they have no chance of hearing the rest of the story or finding out the identity of the second narrator. The first narrator tells the theosophist. The man evidently took us for fools and imposed upon us out of fun. The story is pure fabrication from start to finish. The first narrator then tells the reader that the discussion that followed ended in a lifelong rupture between my theosophist kinsman and myself. End of the summary. Thank you.